In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the multiplication and division of integers. Remember that integers is just a fancy word for whole numbers. As you're watching this video, you shouldn't just be watching it, but you should have your OneNote open and be taking down some notes and annotations as I go through these slides. So first, let's go through our learning objectives. Number 1, to be able to multiply and divide integers. 2, to know that the product or quotient of two numbers of the same sign, i.e. two positive or two negative numbers, is a positive number. And 3, to know that the product or quotient of two numbers of the opposite sign, i.e. a positive number and a negative number, is a negative number. Quite a mouthful. But as we go through these videos, you're going to understand these learning objectives. Let's start by going through learning objective 2, which says, the product or quotient of two numbers of the same sign, i.e. two positive or two negative numbers, is a positive number. Okay, let's break that down. So we know that the word product just means the result of multiplying two numbers together. So A times B, the product of that is AB. And what we're being told here is that when I have two positive numbers multiplied together, my answer is going to also be positive. So here, we obviously don't write them in, but we could if we wanted to. We could put a plus here and a plus here. So when I multiply two positive numbers, my answer is going to be positive. And I can prove that to you. 3 times 4 equals 12. Now, when we're doing multiplication, and we're dealing with positive and negative numbers, I would encourage you not to look at the positive or negatives first. Just answer the question and then deal with the positive or negatives later. So here we have, obviously we have a plus here and a plus there. Of course, they're normally invisible. 3 times 4 is always 12. And because I have two pluses here, my result is going to be a plus as well. But remember, we don't put these pluses in. Now, let's go to our next one. So we're still dealing with the product of two numbers of the same sign, but now instead of dealing with two positive numbers, we're going to be dealing with two negative numbers. So they still have the same sign, but now they're just negative. So now I have negative A times negative B, and as you can see, my answer is once again positive. So I could draw that in if I wanted to. I could show you that it's positive. My answer is once again positive. So let me give you an example which proves that the multiplication of two negative numbers is a positive result. So if I had 3 times 4 equals, but they're both negative, it's negative 3 times negative 4. Again, I would encourage you, just answer 3 times 4 first. Don't even look at those negatives. I know that 3 times 4 is 12. But then I see these two negatives, and I know when I have two negatives multiplying with each other, the answer is going to be positive. So my answer here is going to be positive. But again, you don't have to put in that negative, that positive sign, you can just get rid of it. But we know it's positive, and that's because our rule tells us it is so. So it's as if these two negatives cancel each other out. Let's now move over here, where we're dealing with a quotient of two numbers of the same sign. Now, the word quotient, that just means the result of dividing one number by the other. So here I have A divided by B. They're both positive, and my answer is positive. This is exactly what we saw over here, but now we're dealing with division. So I'm not going to put in my positive signs because we know that they're invisible, but they're there. And 12 divided by 4 equals 3. So a positive number divided by a positive number equals a positive number. And again, you should be writing all this down as I'm doing it. You shouldn't just be watching this video, you should be taking notes along with me. Let's now deal with what's down here. So here you can see that I have a negative number divided by a negative number, and my answer is positive. So if I was to give you an example of this, it's going to be negative 12 divided by negative 4, which is equal to 3. So negative 12 divided by negative 4 is equal to 3. So notice the fact that when I'm dividing two negative numbers, my answer is going to be positive. So with all these examples, hopefully you can walk away confident, knowing that the product or quotient of two numbers of the same sign is always going to be a positive number. Let's now move on to our next learning objective, which tells us the product or quotient of two numbers of the opposite sign, i.e. a positive number and a negative number, is a negative number. So here we have the product of two numbers of the opposite sign. So the product of two numbers of the opposite sign. So in other words, I'm going negative a times positive b, and it's going to be equal to negative ab. So the product of two numbers of the opposite sign is negative. So a negative number times a positive number is going to be a negative result. And if I was to give you proof of this, if I had negative 3 times 4, my answer is going to be negative 12. Again, I would encourage you to answer these questions by first going 3 times 4 is 12, and then look at your negatives. So I have one negative, I have one positive, so my answer is going to be negative 12. Let's now go on to the next one, which is very similar. My negative is just over here this time. So I have a positive number times by a negative number, and my answer is going to be negative AB. So I have a positive times a negative, and my answer is negative. And I could give you an example of this. So again, you should be copying this down as well. 3 times negative 4 equals negative 12. Let's now move on to quotient of two numbers of the opposite sign. So here I have a negative number divided by a positive number, and my answer is negative. So again, I can give you proof of this. If I had negative 12 and I divided it by 4, my answer is going to be negative 3. And again, down here, now my negative is just over here, so I have a positive number divided by a negative number. So I have a positive number divided by a negative number, and my answer is negative. To give you an example of this, if I had 12 divided by negative 4, my answer is going to be negative 3. So again, just to recap this rule, the product or quotient of two numbers of the opposite sign is a negative number. So now it's your turn. I want you to pause the video and give these questions a try. Good luck. So how did you go with it? So I'm going to show you how I like to answer these questions. So if I have 5 times negative 6, I'm just going to ignore that negative. I know that 5 times 6 is 30. And because I only have one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Next, I have 3 times 7. I know that's 21. Because I have two negatives, I know my answer is going to be positive, so I'm going to leave it like that. Next, I have 4 times 8, which is 32. Because I have one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Here I have 9 times 5, which is 45. Because I have two negatives, I know my answer is going to be positive, so I'm going to leave it like that. Here I have 36 divided by 4, which I know is 9. And because I have one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Here I have 18 divided by 9, which is 2. Because I have two negatives, I know my answer is going to be positive. So I'm going to leave it like that. Next, I have 21 divided by 3, which is going to be 7. Because I have two negatives, I know my answer is going to be positive, so I'm going to leave it like that. Next, I have 50 divided by 10, which is going to be 5. Because I have one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. So as you can see, it's quite easy answering this question if you first just deal with multiplying the two numbers and then think about your negatives later. I find this stuff far easier than plussing or minusing negative numbers because it's simple multiplication. Let's now go through some more practice questions. So I want you to answer these, remembering to work left to right to solve the following questions. So pause the video, give these a go, and I'll be back soon. So how did you go with these questions? Let's give them a go together now. So remember that we're working from left to right. So for the time being, let's just ignore the negatives. We'll come back to them later. So if I have negative 7 times 4 divided by negative 2, I'm going to first go, what's 7 times 4? That's 28. Now, because I have a negative number and a positive number, that's going to be a negative 28. Then I'm going to divide by negative 2. Once again, I'm just going to ignore my negatives for the time being and go 28 divided by 2. Well, that's 14. Now, because I do have two negative numbers, I know I'm going to get a positive result. So I'm just going to leave it like that. Let's now go on to the next question, where I have negative 16 times 4 divided by negative 4. Again, for the time being, let's just ignore the negatives. I'm just going to go 16 times 4, that's 64. Now, because I have a negative and a positive, I know this is going to be a negative number. And then I'm going to bring down this negative divided by 4. Again, let's just ignore the negatives for the time being. 64 divided by 4, well, that's just 16. And because I have two negative numbers, I know I'm going to get a positive answer, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Let's now go on to this question, where I have negative 12 divided by 2 times negative 4. Again, for the time being, let's just ignore the negatives. I have 12 divided by 2, which is 6. Now, because I have one negative, I know this answer is going to be negative, and then I'm going to times it by negative 4. So negative 6 times negative 4, let's just ignore the negative. 6 by 4 is 24. And because they're both negative, my answer is going to be positive. Let's come down here. I have 40 divided by negative 2 times negative 3. Again, let's just ignore the negatives for the time being. So I'm going to have 40 divided by 2, which is going to be 20. Now, because I have one negative, I know that my answer is going to be negative. And let me bring down the rest here, which is going to be times negative 3. Now, I know that when I'm timesing two negatives together, I'm going to get a positive result. But let's deal with that at the end. So 20 times 3, well, that's going to be 60. And because I have two negatives, it's going to be a positive answer. So those are going to be my answers for these questions. So hopefully you can appreciate the technique that I'm using, which is just ignore the negatives at first, deal with them at the end. Just treat it like a normal multiplication or division, and then later on, think about your negative or positives, which is very important, but just deal with it at the end. Let's now review what we did today. So what did we do? Let's go through our learning objectives. We had to be able to multiply and divide integers. I think we can do that. We need to know that the product or quotient of two numbers of the same sign, i.e. two positive or two negative numbers, is a positive number. We know that. And to know that the product or quotient of two numbers of the opposite sign, i.e. a positive number and a negative number, is a negative number. I think we know that as well. So hopefully at the end of this video, you feel confident with this material. Good luck doing your homework.